They watched you with quiet certainty, convinced that your story would end in silence, in surrender. They mistook your pauses for weakness, your struggles for endings, and your tears for defeat. But what they never understood is that within you lived a voice that does not break, a spirit that does not bow, and a fire that does not ask for permission to burn. You carried the weight they thought would crush you, and instead of collapsing, you learned how to rise with it. You became the answer to every doubt they whispered, the echo that outlived every attempt to erase you. And now, as you stand here, unbroken, unashamed, undeniable, you are not just a survivor of their expectations. You are the living proof that you were never meant to fail. There were moments when the air around you felt heavier than it should have, when smiles carried something unspoken and support felt just a little too thin to lean on. Not every battle announced itself with noise. Some came wrapped in silence, in hesitation, in the absence of belief where it should have lived. You could feel it, the quiet resistance, the subtle doubt, the unspoken hope that maybe you would not make it as far as you dreamed. It was never loud enough to confront, but always present enough to be felt. They did not always say it directly, but their actions spoke with a clarity that words could never match. Opportunities slipped away without reason, encouragement came half-hearted, and sometimes you were left to walk alone where others were given company. There is a certain kind of opposition that does not push you down, but simply refuses to lift you up, and that absence can feel just as heavy. It plants questions in your mind, makes you wonder if the path you are walking is yours to claim, or if it was never meant for you at all. And then there was doubt, not just theirs, but the kind that slowly tries to make a home inside you. It whispers in your quiet moments, asking if they were right, if your efforts are enough, if your strength has limits you have not yet reached. That is the most delicate part of the struggle, because the outside voices are easier to recognize than the one that begins to echo within. When doubt starts to sound like your own voice, the battle becomes deeply personal. But even then, something in you refused to agree with that narrative. Even when uncertainty stood at your door, you did not fully let it in. You questioned yourself, yes, but you kept moving. You felt the weight of unseen opposition, but you did not let it decide your direction. There is a quiet kind of courage in that, to continue without applause, to believe without evidence, to rise without being lifted. What they never understood is that their silence did not weaken you, it refined you. Their doubt did not define you, it challenged you to define yourself. Every moment you stood without support, you learned how to become your own foundation. Every time belief was withheld, you discovered how to generate it from within. You were not being pushed out of your path. You were being prepared to walk it without dependence on anyone else's approval. And now, looking back, you can see it more clearly. What felt like a quiet plot against you was, in its own way, a test of your endurance, your clarity, your sense of self. Because it is one thing to rise when the world believes in you, but it is something far more powerful to rise when it does not. You did not just overcome obstacles. You outgrew the need for validation from those who could not see your vision. So you stand now, not untouched by doubt or untouched by struggle, but untouched by the limits they tried to place on you. And in that quiet, undeniable strength, you have already rewritten everything they once expected of you. There is a peculiar kind of dismissal that does not arrive with insult but with assumption. It is the look that passes over you too quickly, the decision made about you before you have spoken, the quiet conclusion that you are not quite enough. They measured you with shallow eyes and small expectations, believing they had already seen your limits. And in that moment, without noise or confrontation, they placed you in a space beneath your true potential, certain you would remain there. To be underestimated is to be handed both a burden and a strange, hidden advantage. The burden is real. It can make doors harder to open, voices harder to hear, and opportunities slower to arrive. It asks you to prove what others are freely given, to carry a weight you did not choose. But the advantage lives quietly beneath it all, waiting for you to recognize it. Because when no one expects much from you, they stop watching closely. They stop preparing for your rise. They leave space, unintended, unguarded space, for you to grow beyond their imagination. There were times you felt the sting of it, when being overlooked felt like being erased. You questioned whether you were invisible or simply not valuable in the way you had hoped to be. That feeling can settle deep if you let it, shaping how you see yourself rather than how they see you. And that is where the real danger lies, not in their underestimation, but in the possibility that you might begin to agree with it. But you did not stay there. Even when their doubt brushed against your confidence, something within you resisted being reduced. You began to understand that their vision was limited, not your ability. You realized that being seen as less did not make you less. It only revealed how little they were willing or able to see. And once that truth settled in you, something shifted. You stopped performing for their approval and started building from your own belief. You learned to move differently, not loudly to demand attention, but steadily with purpose. You allowed your work, your persistence, your growth to speak in ways that no assumption could silence. And as time passed, the very people who once overlooked you found themselves surprised, not because you changed suddenly, but because they had never truly seen you to begin with. There is power in that kind of misjudgment. It sharpens your focus, strengthens your independence, and teaches you to rely on something deeper than recognition. You were never meant to fit into the small spaces they imagined for you. You were meant to outgrow them entirely, to expand in ways that could not be contained by someone else's limited perspective. And now, when you stand in your strength, it is not borrowed from their validation. It is built from every moment you chose not to shrink, every time you refused to be defined by a narrow view. They underestimated you, yes, but in doing so, they gave you the freedom to become more than they could ever predict. Pain did not arrive in your life as something gentle or easily understood. It came uninvited, sometimes all at once, sometimes in slow, quiet waves that lingered longer than you expected. It wore many faces: betrayal that cut deeper than words, rejection that echoed in your thoughts long after the moment had passed, and hardships that seemed to ask more of you than you believed you could give. In those moments, it was easy to see pain as an ending, as something meant to confine you, to hold you in a place where growth felt impossible. There is a way pain can begin to shape the walls around you if you let it. It can convince you to close off, to trust less, to expect disappointment before hope has a chance to breathe. It whispers that what hurt you once will hurt you again, and that the safest way forward is to remain still, guarded, and small. That is how pain tries to become a prison, not through force, but through fear. Not by stopping you physically, but by slowly persuading you to stop yourself. But something within you refused to let pain define the boundaries of your life. Even when it weighed heavily on your spirit, you did not allow it to become your identity. You felt it, you carried it, but you also questioned it. You began to ask what it was trying to show you, rather than simply accepting what it was trying to take from you. And in that shift, from resistance to understanding, pain started to change its role in your life. You began to see that every moment of betrayal sharpened your awareness, teaching you the difference between presence and pretense. Every rejection redirected your path, not always towards something easier, but towards something more aligned with who you truly are. Hardship, as relentless as it felt, built a resilience in you that comfort never could. These lessons did not come wrapped in ease, and they did not arrive without cost, but they carried a value that could not be ignored. It is not that the pain disappeared or became something pleasant. It is that you learned how to stand beside it without letting it overshadow everything else. You allowed it to inform you, but not to control you. You let it deepen your understanding without narrowing your vision. And in doing so, you transformed it from something that could have confined you into something that quietly refined you. There is a strength that comes from this kind of transformation, one that is not loud or easily displayed. It is steady, grounded, and deeply rooted in experience. It allows you to move forward without denying where you have been. It gives you the ability to face new challenges without being undone by the memory of old ones. Because once pain becomes a teacher, it no longer holds the same power to trap you. And now, when you look back, you can see that what once felt like weight was also shaping your foundation. It was preparing you, strengthening you, and guiding you in ways you could not fully understand at the time. You were never meant to live within your pain. You were meant to learn from it, grow through it, and walk forward carrying its wisdom, not its chains. There is a moment in every life when staying down begins to feel easier than rising again. Not because you lack strength, but because repetition of disappointment can make stillness feel safer than movement. The world, in its own quiet ways, sometimes seems to lean in that direction too, waiting for you to accept defeat, to settle into silence, to let what hurt you become the final word in your story. And in those moments, rising again is not just an action. It becomes a decision that goes against everything that tries to hold you still. To rise anyway is rarely a single act. It is not loud, not dramatic in the way people often imagine courage to be. It begins in small, almost invisible choices. The choice to try again when nothing around you has changed. The choice to believe that yesterday's failure does not own tomorrow. The choice to breathe deeply into disappointment and still take a step forward, even when that step feels uncertain. These are the quiet beginnings of resilience that no one always sees, but they shape everything that follows. There were days when standing tall did not feel natural, when the weight of expectation, both yours and others, pressed heavily against your sense of direction. It can feel disorienting when life does not reflect your effort, when your intentions are strong, but the outcomes remain unclear. In those moments, the temptation is not always to give up loudly. Sometimes it is to simply stop believing that effort matters. That is the subtle erosion that rising must resist. But something within you refused to fully surrender to that stillness. Even when the world seemed to suggest that you remain where you had fallen, there was a part of you that remembered movement. Not because the path was clear, but because remaining stagnant felt like a quiet betrayal of everything you had already endured. So you rose, not because it was easy, but because something deeper than ease was calling you forward. And each time you rose, even slightly, even imperfectly, something inside you began to realign. You started to understand that rising is not about returning to who you were before the fall, but about becoming someone who knows how to live after it. There is a difference between innocence and awareness, between untouched confidence and earned strength. You began to carry the latter without needing to announce it. The world may not always acknowledge these moments. Often, it only recognizes the outcome, not the effort behind it. But what matters is that you did not remain where you were expected to stay. You did not let circumstance decide your final position. Instead, you kept choosing motion over surrender, even when progress felt slow or uncertain. And over time, those choices accumulated into something undeniable. Not a sudden transformation, but a steady unfolding. You became someone who understands that falling is not the opposite of rising. Staying down is, and you chose differently. Again and again, in ways both seen and unseen, you chose to rise anyway. There is a kind of silence that is not empty, but full. It does not come from having nothing to say, but from choosing not to waste energy proving what time will eventually reveal on its own. It is the silence that forms when you no longer chase understanding from those who were never truly listening. In that space, something changes. You stop explaining yourself in fragments, stop defending your growth to people who only recognize your past, and begin to understand that not every truth needs to be spoken to be real. At first, silence can feel uncomfortable. You are used to reacting, used to responding. used to filling gaps with words that try to bridge misunderstanding. There is a certain pressure in being misread, a quiet urge to correct every assumption, to rewrite every false conclusion others have drawn about you. But over time, you begin to notice that not all misunderstandings are worth your voice, and not all ears are ready for your truth. So you step back, not in defeat, but in awareness. And in that stepping back, something unexpected begins to happen. Your life starts speaking in ways your words never could. The way you carry yourself begins to shift. The decisions you make, the discipline you build, the direction you choose, all of it starts to form a language that requires no explanation. It is not loud, but it is clear. It does not demand attention, but it earns recognition over time. There were moments when you could have spoken, when defending yourself would have felt justified, even necessary. But instead, you chose to let time do what arguments could not. You let your consistency answer what criticism could not silence. You let your progress speak into spaces where doubt once lived. And slowly, without announcement, the narrative around you began to change. Not because you forced it, but because you outgrew the version of you they once misunderstood. Silence, in this sense, was never absence. It was strategy shaped by peace. It was the understanding that not every battle requires engagement, and not every opinion deserves your response. There is a strength in withholding reaction, in allowing your focus to remain untouched by distraction. While others expected you to explain yourself endlessly, you chose instead to build something undeniable. And as you continued forward, your growth became difficult to ignore, not because you asked to be seen, but because you became something that could no longer be overlooked. The same people who once questioned your direction began to notice your stability. The same voices that once doubted your potential began to soften in the presence of your results. Not because you argued louder, but because you lived clearer. In time, you realized that silence was never about retreating from the world. It was about refusing to be reduced by it. It was about protecting your energy from unnecessary noise so your purpose could develop without interruption. And in that quiet, something powerful took shape, a version of you that did not need constant validation to continue becoming. So you remained steady. You allowed your growth to speak where your words once tried to. And in doing so, you discovered that the loudest statement you can ever make is not spoken at all. It is lived consistently until even silence begins to carry your name. There are battles that never reach the surface of your life, the kind that do not leave visible marks for others to question or comfort. They happen in the quiet hours, when the world is asleep or simply unaware of what you are carrying inside. These are the moments when your thoughts become heavier than your surroundings, when your breath feels steady on the outside but uneven within. No one claps for these battles because no one sees them unfolding, yet they shape you in ways nothing else ever could. In those unseen hours, you learn a different language of endurance. It is not loud or expressive. It does not ask for attention or recognition. It is the kind of strength that forms when you have no choice but to sit with your own uncertainty and still choose not to abandon yourself. You sit with questions that have no immediate answers, with emotions that do not resolve quickly, and with hopes that feel fragile in the absence of reassurance. And still, you continue. There is something deeply personal about fighting battles that no one knows about. You cannot rely on sympathy, because there is nothing for others to respond to. You cannot depend on applause, because there is no audience watching your effort. You are left with yourself, and that alone becomes both the weight and the witness of your journey. In that solitude, you begin to understand what it means to truly endure, not for recognition, but for survival, for growth, for something within you that refuses to let go of becoming. And while these battles feel isolating, they are also shaping something powerful inside you. They teach you how to sit with discomfort without letting it define you. They teach you how to move forward, even when clarity has not yet arrived. They teach you that resilience is not always built in moments of triumph, but often in moments where no triumph is visible at all. It is formed quietly, layer by layer, in the spaces where you chose not to give up on yourself. Over time, you start to notice that these unseen battles leave behind something lasting, not scars that weaken you, but depth that strengthens you. You begin to respond differently to difficulty. What once overwhelmed you now meets a steadier version of you. What once broke your focus now only slows your pace briefly before you continue again. You are no longer shaped only by what happens to you, but by how you learn to remain present through it. And perhaps the most profound part is that no one else needs to fully understand these battles for them to matter. Their value is not dependent on recognition. Their significance is carried in who you became because of them. You are not the same person who first entered those quiet struggles. Something in you adapted, strengthened, and expanded in ways that cannot always be explained, but can always be felt. So when you look at your life now, you are not only seeing visible achievements or obvious milestones. You are also standing on the foundation of countless private moments where you chose not to break, not to disappear, not to surrender. And that foundation holds a kind of strength that does not need validation because it was built in silence, carried in solitude, and proven through your continued becoming. There is a strange weight that doubt carries when it begins to settle into your thoughts. It does not arrive with force, it arrives with suggestion. It questions rather than commands, whispers rather than shouts, until slowly you start to entertain its presence as if it has always belonged there. It asks whether you are capable, whether you are ready, whether what you are reaching for is meant for you at all. And if you are not careful, it begins to sound less like an outside voice and more like something you created yourself. In the beginning, doubt feels like hesitation. You pause more often, reconsider things you once approached with confidence, and start measuring your steps instead of taking them. What once felt natural begins to feel uncertain, as if every direction requires permission you have not yet been given. It is not that your ability disappears, but that your belief in it becomes temporarily clouded. And in that clouding, movement slows. But there is something important that happens when doubt is not avoided but observed. You begin to see it not as truth, but as pressure, not as definition, but as distortion. It reflects fears more than facts, limitations more than reality. And once you recognize that, something in you begins to separate from it. You stop treating every uncertain thought as instruction and start treating it as a passing condition. There is a turning point, often quiet, where doubt stops being a stop sign and becomes a question. And in that question, something new begins to form. Instead of asking whether you can continue, you start asking what would happen if you did. Instead of accepting limitation, you begin exploring possibility. This shift is subtle, but it changes the direction of everything that follows. Because when doubt loses its authority, it does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes fuel, not because it is pleasant, but because it is present. It shows you where you have been afraid to grow, where you have been hesitant to trust yourself, where you have been waiting for certainty that was never meant to arrive before action. And in that realization, direction begins to emerge. What once held you back starts to push you forward in an unexpected way. Every moment you questioned yourself becomes a reminder of how far you are willing to go to find clarity. Every instance of uncertainty becomes proof that you are engaged with something meaningful enough to challenge you. You stop seeing doubt as a verdict and start seeing it as part of the process of becoming. And slowly, what was once heaviness begins to turn into motion. You begin to act, not because everything feels clear, but because waiting for complete clarity is no longer necessary. Purpose does not always arrive fully formed. Sometimes it is shaped through movement, through testing, through learning what does and does not align with who you are becoming. In time, you realize that doubt did not define your limits. It revealed your willingness to go beyond them. It pointed you toward the edges of your comfort where growth quietly waits. And when you moved through it instead of stopping at it, you did not just overcome doubt, you transformed it into direction, into momentum, into something that carried you forward rather than holding you still. There comes a point in your journey when you realize that reaching your goal is not the final challenge. Standing in it is. Achieving something you once only imagined can feel surreal at first, as if you are waiting for someone to question whether you belong there. And sometimes, without even noticing it, you begin to soften your presence, to speak a little less about what you have built, to step slightly out of the light so that it does not disturb those still walking toward it. But success was never meant to be something you shrink inside of. There is a subtle pressure that often follows accomplishment. It does not always come from others directly. Sometimes it comes from within, a quiet voice that asks you to remain modest in a way that slowly erases your confidence. It suggests that celebrating your progress might be mistaken for arrogance, that acknowledging how far you have come might make others uncomfortable. And so you begin to lower your voice in rooms where you have every right to stand fully present. But your victory was not accidental. It was not handed to you without effort, without sacrifice, without the moments when you continued despite uncertainty. You know what it cost you to arrive where you are. You remember the days when progress felt invisible, when effort felt unanswered, when continuation required more belief than you thought you had. And because of that, your success is not something fragile. It is something earned through persistence. To own your victory without apology is not to diminish others, nor is it to separate yourself from humility. It is to recognize that shrinking does not honor the journey that brought you here. There is a difference between humility and invisibility, between grace and self-erasure. You can respect others without reducing yourself. You can remain grounded without denying your growth. There may still be moments when you feel the instinct to step back, to make your success seem smaller so it feels easier for others to accept. But every time you do that, you distance yourself from the truth of your own becoming. You did not go through what you went through to stand uncertain in your own achievements. You went through it to arrive here fully, not partially, not cautiously, but completely aware of what you have overcome. And as you learn to remain present in your success, something important begins to shift. You stop viewing your accomplishments as things that need justification and start seeing them as facts of your journey. You speak about them not to seek validation, but to acknowledge reality. You stand in them not to compare, but to recognize the version of yourself that once hoped for this moment. Over time, owning your victory becomes less about confidence and more about honesty. It becomes difficult to deny what is already visible in your life. The work you have done, the growth you have experienced, the strength you have developed, they exist regardless of how quietly you choose to speak about them. And you begin to understand that denying your success does not make others more comfortable. It only makes your journey less complete. So you stand differently now. Not louder, not harsher, but clearer. You allow yourself to exist in the fullness of what you have achieved. You no longer apologize for arriving where effort, resilience, and persistence have taken you. And in that quiet acceptance, you realize that true strength is not only in becoming successful, but in remaining unshaken while standing in it. There is a quiet kind of transformation that happens when you stop trying to convince people and start simply becoming. It is no longer about arguments or explanations, no longer about trying to correct every doubt that was once spoken over your life. Instead, it becomes about time doing what words never could. You continue forward, not to prove them wrong in anger, but to prove something truer to yourself, that their expectations were never the ceiling of your existence. At first, they may not notice the change. People often hold on to the version of you that is easiest for them to remember, not the one you are becoming. So they continue speaking from old impressions, outdated assumptions, and conclusions formed long before your growth began to take shape. But growth has a way of outlasting perception. It does not rush to announce itself. It simply continues until it becomes impossible to ignore. And slowly, without needing confrontation, you begin to embody something they did not prepare for. Not a reaction, not a rebellion, but a quiet evolution. You are no longer responding to the expectations that were placed on you. You are moving in a direction shaped by your own persistence, your own understanding, your own refusal to remain confined within someone else's limited vision. There is something powerful about becoming without permission. It removes the need for approval from those who once doubted your direction. You stop looking back to measure whether they are watching, whether they are acknowledging, whether they are finally understanding. Because you begin to realize that your life was never meant to be a performance for their acceptance. It was meant to unfold according to something deeper within you.